to speak on a few different sections of this book, Compass of Zen. For those of you who don't know, it's a book put together by our founding teacher, Zen Master Bon Soeng, and essentially he goes through the basic teachings in Buddhism. He starts off with Theravadan Buddhism, moves on to Mahayana Buddhism, and then finally to Zen Buddhism. But actually the whole book is a Zen Buddhist view of all of Buddhism. So the parts that I'm going to read tonight are from the Theravadan section of Buddhism. This part of Buddhism is the first. Sometimes they talk in Buddhism about turning of the Dharma wheel. And this Theravadan Buddhism is the first turning. It's the most basic part of Buddhism. And in some ways, you could say it's the most, it's the one that's concerned the most with explanation. And a lot of what I'm talking about tonight leads up to the Buddhist theory and understanding of suffering. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is basic Buddhist view and how we get into the mess that we find ourselves in. Remember, Buddhism is very basically about suffering and the alleviation of suffering. At its most basic level, Buddhism is not very metaphysical. It became a little bit more metaphysical as it went into China. But from the Indian perspective, it was a very practical approach to looking at our lives, investigating the mess that we're in, and through that investigation, actually discovering for ourselves how to get out of the mess. So actually, the chapters that I'm going to talk about tonight precede the chapter on the Four Noble Truths. So in essence, they lead up to, this is what the Buddha dealt with as the origins of suffering, or pieces of the origins of suffering. And then through his solving this mystery, you could say, he came up with what we call the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is suffering is the basic condition of humans, of human life. Suffering comes from desire. We can stop desire by ending suffering. And the way to end suffering is embodied in the Eightfold Path. Now, it's interesting because I'm going to start off with the section of insight into non-self, followed by the section on dependent origination, and then followed by the 12 links in the chain of dependent origination. Now, interestingly, the way the Four Noble Truths are written here in the book, suffering, then there's an arrow that says, all things are suffering. And then what I call suffering is caused by desire. He says it strictly as origination. And it's described by the 12 links of dependent origination in order, which I said I'm going to get to. We alleviate suffering by reversing the 12 links of dependent origination. So it's a little complicated. I feel a little bit more like a college professor today. In Theravadan Buddhism, they say suffering is caused. The three main points of Theravadan Buddhism is insight into impermanence, insight into impurity, and insight into non-self. So in a sense, I'm covering impermanence and impurity along with non-self. So you could say this talk is about impermanence, conditioning, and how the conditioning happens. So a small, stupid story about impermanence. My wife and I shop at the Berkeley Bowl. And I grew up in suburban New York City in a Jewish family. And one of the things we ate when I was growing up were half sour pickles. And I don't know, about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer, the Berkeley Bowl started carrying just the kind of half sour pickles that I ate growing up. And I started buying them. And tonight, in fact, my wife went shopping at the Berkeley Bowl. And before she went, I reminded her I needed pickles. I noticed last week, I haven't had the pickles for a few weeks, and I noticed last week when I was shopping, there wasn't even a tag where they belong with the price. And tonight, she actually called me up for something else while she was shopping, and I reminded her that I needed pickles, and she said the pickles weren't there. So I'm now, maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm now putting this together with the fact that last week there wasn't even a space for them, and my hunch is they've stopped carrying them. That's impermanence. Very simply put. You have something, but then you don't have it. How we deal with impermanence often sets the quality of our suffering. I could be very upset that I won't have my pickles anymore. I can get furious about not having my pickles anymore. Or I can let them go. If I get really upset about not having my pickles, I suffer. If I let it go, I don't suffer. It's quite simple. The truth that the Buddha discovered is that everything which has name and form changes and disappears. Sometimes in Buddhism we call this the law of appearing and disappearing. Everything that that has name and form, everything in our world appears, thrives for a while, starts to decay, and then passes away. That's the truth of human experience. It's not only human experience. Redwood trees last for a couple of thousand years, but eventually, even the redwood tree dies. A mosquito, I've been told, lasts one day. Maybe it's a few more days, I don't know. But a mosquito's life is quite short. So even to say a mosquito's life is short is a relative statement determined by me in this case, because I think in terms of human life. Human life feels like the right length. Of course, everybody's human life varies. Nobody guarantees our life. I spent one day in a long meditation retreat going over my life and thinking about all the people that I knew who had died. And what I realized was, at every point in my life, somebody died. And I don't mean I was a child and my grandmother died. Looking back, I knew children who died. My best friend, when I was 5, died when he was 19. Another close friend of mine from high school died when he was 36. There was a young woman in my elementary school who died before we got out of high school. She was a young girl. She never made it to young womanhood. She died before we got out of high school. So think about it. How many people you've known who've died? And many of them dying before you think it's their time. Very often, even if we're old, we don't think it's our time. Things are always arising and passing away. In this book, he says, arising, stability, decline, dissolution. How do we deal with that? Sometimes I say that the essence of the Buddha's teaching is we suffer because we either don't have what we want, so we're unhappy, or we have what we want, but everything is always changing. So somewhere inside, we know we're going to lose it, and we fight against that. So if everything is always changing, what we as human beings have to find is a way to deal with that. But we're not very good at it, right? Be honest. How good are you at loss? How good are you at abandonment? How is it when the person you love rejects you? Or they just go away? Or they want somebody else? These are the human pains. This is the suffering of human beings. How we deal with that suffering determines our life. The essence in all of these chapters is we determine our life by how we handle it. And our life is created by conditions. Something arises, it arises out of conditions. The whole world is formed by cause and effect. Think of your own life. Where did you come from? We don't know. But scientifically we know the sperm from our father and the egg of our mothers come together and form this new organism. We didn't ask to be here, or maybe we did. We don't know. In Buddhism, there's the belief of reincarnation. It's interesting because as I've gone through this chapter of non-self, insight into non-self, what you come up with is reincarnation. Where did we come from? In the Buddhist view, we have lifetime after lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And what we call a self, in Buddhism is looked at as habit mind. We have some kind of mind. We habitually start to respond in that way, and that solidifies into a habit. Strict Buddhist teaching teaches those habits form over lifetimes. So as I read through this, I start to wonder, because I don't actually have a sense of reincarnation. I almost would say I don't believe in reincarnation. But honestly, as I've been thinking about it, preparing for this talk, I have no idea. I don't know if there's reincarnation or not. There's a movie that I saw. I meant to check on the name of it. It's on Netflix. It's about this Tibetan boy that is found, and he's found to be a Rinpoche, who is the reincarnation of the Rinpoche who died before. And one of the students, I wish I remembered the name, I meant to check. Look it up if you have Netflix, it's streaming. It's a quite interesting movie because they find that a young attendant of the Rinpoche who died sets out to look for his reincarnation. And he goes around the area in Tibet, or probably it's Nepal, where he's living, where the teacher is taught. And through a lot of trial and error, he comes up with this young boy. And the way they test the boy for whether he's the Rinpoche or not is they show a series of objects. They take the personal objects of the Rinpoche and they put them, like, let's say they took the Rinpoche's beads, they put his beads and some other beads in front of the young boy. The boy's about 5 years old, I think. And the boy picks up the Rinpoche's beads. And they do this 3 or 4 times. And that convinces the old lamas that he's the reincarnation. To me, the most interesting part of this movie was after he's anointed, literally, as the reincarnate Rinpoche, they take the boy to his retreat hut. And the boy walks into the hut, and it's like he recognizes everything. And there's a hole in the floor. And the boy looks down and says, "When did that happen?" Because when he was alive, there was no hole in the floor. So this movie, it hit my mind. Because I can say I don't believe it. But what's the reality of my beliefs? Where do my beliefs come from? And how do I know they're true? So Buddhism teaches to keep great doubt. Great doubt is the approach to life, but it's very difficult to keep great doubt. So, this first chapter, Insight into Non-Self, just listen to that. Buddhism presents the truth that our self does not exist. Buddhism presents that there is no abiding self. Take a look at your own sense of self. How strongly we hold to this I. I equals self. So in Zen practice, the fundamental question is, what am I? Where you can say, what is I? Who are you? Where do you come from? How do you know you exist? And do you really exist as you think you do? What Buddhism teaches is mind has no self-nature. Our minds are made up of thinking and feeling. And how we create a kind of consciousness determines who we think we are. But how do we know that's who we really are? I've told this story before, but when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I remember standing in the garage of my house, and I had this very bizarre feeling. And I had the senses, my thought was, maybe all existence is the dream of a bear. That's kind of a silly thought, but we don't know. Somebody commented on the internet as I was looking up some of these concepts, how this belief in non-self and that our existence is created out of conditions is actually quite close to quantum physics. And that in some sense, through studying his mind, the Buddha got some very deep insight into the reality of this human world. We think we know so clearly what things are. But check it out. Do you really know? Or is that what you believe? We think of ourselves as Jeff or Chris or Paul or Charlotte. We have these names. And then we associate everything with that name. And then we say, that's who I am. A lot of times we have a turn of phrase, I'm not like that, or I don't do that. But we often say that right after we've done something that we don't think is like us. So, from the Zen perspective, we're opening up our idea of self. In this chapter of Insight into Non-Self, Zen Master Bon Soeng says, mind has no self-nature, so that is the insight into non-self. If we investigate our minds, we realize that there's nothing there. There's no home there. It's a series of thoughts and feelings and conditions that have coalesced into this mass that we call I. And then he says, our body is like a rental car. We get it for a while, but then we have to return it. With that sense of reincarnation, our body is a rental car, but then you just pick up another rental car. But I ask, who's picking up the rental car? Before you were in this rental car, where were you? And soon, this rental car, you might not give it back willingly, but at its best, in the best case scenario, it deteriorates and dies. That's the best case scenario. We all know a lot of worst case scenarios. So, let's see if I covered this. So all external phenomena arises, has stability, declines, dissolves. All aspects of mind arise, are stable, differentiate, and then move to extinction. In a funny way, if there's no self, then everything is created by cause and effect. That's the law of conditioning. This is where I go into something of a psychological explanation. If you just leave out reincarnation for a minute, we're born into a very particular situation. And each one of us, besides the fact that most of us, not all of us of course, but most of us grow up in the family that we're born into. So we inherit the physicality of our parents. So we're born into a family, and we've already, in a sense, been reincarnated from our family line. The genetic material that makes us up has been around for, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of years. And our own particularity is the way those two family lines come together. And then we're born. And then the conditions of our family help to determine how our consciousness coalesces. We bring in the memories, the genetic memories of our tribes. And then we're born into the psychological madness of our families. And we have to find a way to survive that. So we learn. We're constantly learning. We're constantly evaluating and judging and deciding how to best get our needs met. I was listening to this little story on the radio today about early childhood education. And they started off in a family where there were college graduates who the child, who were the parents of the child. And they said by the time the kid is 5 years old, they've heard millions of words. They've learned language and a lot of conceptual thought because their parents have been speaking to them in this way. And then they compared it to a disadvantaged child who grows up in a family who doesn't have the vocabulary, doesn't have the means of enrichment that the rich family has. And that child, when they reach elementary school, starts off with a deficit because they don't have the language skills that the child from a higher socioeconomic family has. That doesn't mean that those children have any less ability, but they have less opportunity. They've been conditioned differently. If you grow up in one family, you're conditioned in a particular way. You grow up in a different family, you're conditioned in a different way. So, is there a fixed self? Or does the self adapt to circumstances? Think of your own life. You haven't been the same your whole life. You're constantly changing. The self you are today is not the self you were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 25 years ago. And if you're older, much longer. I've changed my view, but I used to think I was just like, when I was 8 years old, I was just like I am now. I think back to my experience as an 8-year-old, and I see it through my present-day eyes. And I see my responses and my reactions, and I see them through the lens of the 59-year-old man that I am today. Just so happens my nephew is 8 years old, and I watch him, and we're not the same. We don't process the same. We don't deal with situations in the same way. But think of your own life. I had an aunt who at 75 had a stroke, and she was paralyzed on one side. And she was in a nursing home, and she told me, she said, I still feel like I'm a teenager. There she is lying in a bed, can't move, has a feeding tube. But her consciousness, she still felt like a teenager. But she's not anymore. Actually, now she's dead. So our idea of self and the reality of self are two different things. So our Zen practice asks the question, what am I? What is this self? And through doubt and inquiry, we discover things. So everything we do in Zen is about shaking us out of our perceived ideas to see closer to what's true. This always happens when I give a talk like this. I've got a lot of notes. I've gotten through about 4 lines. But I do want to push through a little bit. I'm just going to read a few things. Our world is 2 dimensions, time and space. In Mahayana Buddhism, we're concerned about a question of space. Is this a cup or is this not a cup? What is a cup? There's water inside of this cup. Where did the water come from? This floor is made of wood. So a floor is not really a floor. A floor is the name for something. There's all these strips of wood, and there are metal nails that are holding this floor down. And where did the wood come from? This is fir, so the wood came from a fir tree. What's a fir tree? Okay, we know a fir tree is a name for a kind of tree. If you have a fir tree, you get fir wood. But the tree needs sunlight, it needs soil, it needs food, it needs oxygen. Without all of those factors, there's no tree. We separate things in our minds as if they have their own individual nature. If you remember anything about this talk, remember interdependency. We think of objects as independent. But what the Buddha discovered, and what quantum physics discovers, and what any real looking at our world discovers, is that everything is made up of everything else. Really, you can't separate anything out. If I am here, something is here. If I am not here, that thing is not here. Zen Master Bon Soeng goes through a story about a rainbow. He says, you see a rainbow, and you have a rainbow. If you don't see the rainbow, there is no rainbow. And if 10 people see a rainbow, you have 10 different rainbows. We think there's one rainbow, but depending on where you look at it from and how you see it determines the rainbow. We make our own world. When my father died, his world died. But what struck me was my world and everybody else's world continued. His world is dead. My world continued. A friend of mine once called that being written out of the script. The script goes on, the movie keeps going, but your movie is over. So I've got 2 stars next to this. We make our own world. We make our own time and space. This is fundamental Buddhist teaching. We make the cause, and our actions combined with the cause determine the effect, which controls our world. So as we become clear, our world becomes clear. They go as far as to say, they give an example. If you plant a yellow bean, you grow yellow beans. If you plant a green bean, you grow green beans. Cause and effect. I want to read one thing. I want to read something to you. This is a little complicated, so I'm taking a risk. You probably won't catch all this. But you can always go to this book. You can get it on Amazon. This is actually quite important, although it's very complicated. And it's called The 12 Links in the Chain of Dependent Origination. And as I said, suffering is caused by the chain going forward. We get out of suffering by deconstructing the chain, going backwards. So, let's see if you can follow this. The chain begins with the appearance of a single thought in our mind. Ignorance. Our thoughts are ignorance. Ignorance means not perceiving that this world is impermanent, believing that it is real or existent. It is a very simple point. When we don't realize the world's impermanence, we believe that our thinking and everything else is real and has some abiding, independent existence. Get that? Ignorance causes us to become attached to our thoughts, our desires, and the sensory life of our bodies. Because ignorance is the subtle belief that all of these, quote, things are real. This arising of ignorance leads to some idea, some, and this is the Buddhist phrase, mental formation. Another name for mental formation is karma, the habitual force that we have brought into this life from another, or you can say this moment from another moment. This moment appears, the past is how we understand the present. And as we act from our past understanding, the future that we create is determined by the past. That's what that means. Through the habit force of our mental formations, consciousness appears. It can be likened to a seed, the beginning of some aggregate thought that, quote, I am. From this point, thinking and consciousness begin to create the realm of name and form. Once you have fostered this sense of I am, you create ideas about the things that are not part of this I. The senses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, begin here. So then human beings enter the realm of touch or contact with the things of the world. We experience these sensations made on the 6 sense organs through contact. From this point on, human consciousness is completely controlled by our habitual experience of the 6 senses. Because from sensation comes desire for more sensation, and more sensation, there naturally arise desire and clinging to these sensations. I like that. I want more. I need more. This kind of mind appears. Now I has made name and form, and through the six senses has become attached to this world and its many sensations. Therefore, the belief in some kind of existence follows. I think, therefore I am. I see, therefore I am. I hear, therefore I am. If something exists, then something else must not exist. This means the creation of life. I am alive. I am 30 years old. When our thinking makes life, it also makes old age, suffering, and ultimately death. That is our suffering world. That was a lot to hold. The 12 links are: ignorance leads to mental formation, which leads to consciousness, which leads to name and form, which leads to the six senses, which leads to contact, which leads to sensation, which leads to desire, leads to clinging, leads to existence, leads to life, leads to old age, suffering, and death. The antidote for the mistake of not recognizing impermanence is recognizing interdependence. Everything is dependent on everything else. I am not separate from the things that are not I. In fact, I is the whole universe. We separate ourselves. We think of ourselves as individuals in this room, but we're a group within this room, and this room is us. Perceiving the world as interdependent frees us from the illusion of a separate self. And once we're freed from the illusion of a separate self, we can let go of our clinging, let go of our ideas, let go of our opinions, and see the world more clearly. And coming back finally to the Zen view, putting down our ideas and opinions, letting go of our thinking and feeling, and seeing things in their absolute nature, gives us freedom, and we actually can be in this world just as it is.